Brayden Tate hadn't spoken to another soul in person in over 6 weeks until a woman with tangled hair, muddy boots, and a fistful of daisies showed up on the front steps of his million-dollar villa and rang the bell like she owned the place. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood behind the thick glass of the double doors, arms crossed, shirtless and barefoot, watching her with quiet disbelief. No one ever came here. Ever. Not even delivery drivers. His staff knew better than to disturb him. But there she was, smiling. "Hi," she shouted through the glass, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "This is gonna sound weird, but I think I might have just crashed my car into your fence." Brayden didn't move. "I didn't mean to," she added, her voice muffled but cheerful. "There was a deer. A big one. I swerved. Total accident. But the fence? Yeah, it's kind of toast." She leaned closer, pressing her nose against the glass like a curious kid. "Are you gonna open the door, or just stand there looking like you belong in a cologne ad?" Brayden blinked. Then, against his better judgment and everything he'd built to keep the world out, he unlocked the door. She stepped in like a gust of spring air, dragging the scent of rain, wildflowers, and something warm he hadn't felt in years. "I'm Willa Keane," she said, holding out her hand. "And I'm really, really sorry about your fence." He looked at her hand, then back up at her face. She had freckles, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and her eyes, light hazel, almost golden, held no fear. Just curiosity. "I'm not used to visitors," Brayden said flatly. "I figured," Willa replied, craning her neck to look at the marble floors and oversized chandelier. "This place is like rich people quiet. Creepy quiet." Brayden raised an eyebrow. "You think my home is creepy?" "Only a little. No offense. It's just big and cold. Like a museum. Do you ever think about getting a dog? Or, I don't know, a throw pillow?" He stared at her, stunned. She grinned again, completely unfazed. "I was on my way to a friend's cabin up the mountain. Took a wrong turn. Deer jumped out. Boom. Fence. So, can I use your phone?" "My battery's dead." He led her to the kitchen, handed her the landline, and watched as she attempted to call her friend. No answer. "Looks like I'm stranded," she said, leaning against the marble counter. "You don't happen to have a guest room, do you?" "I don't allow guests," Brayden said automatically.
"Right.
Of course." He expected her to panic, or plead, or get dramatic. Instead, she shrugged, walked over to the window, and said, "You've got a wicked view."
Seriously.
"That lake, those trees. It's like a postcard. Must be nice to wake up to that." Brayden didn't respond. He hadn't noticed the view in months. Willa turned to him. "Look, I'll sleep on the floor, if I have to. Just for tonight. It's raining, my car's shot, and I'm not exactly dressed for hiking back down the mountain." He hesitated. She crossed her arms. "You really gonna send me out like that? I brought you daisies." Brayden looked down at the crumpled flowers in her hand. She'd held onto them all this time.
He sighed.
"One night.
Deal."
Brayden hadn't used the guest wing in over 2 years. He gave her the room farthest from his and left her with towels, a robe, and an awkward good night before retreating to his side of the house. He didn't sleep. Instead, he lay in bed, wondering why in the hell he let her in. Why she didn't annoy him. Why he couldn't stop hearing her laughter echoing through his otherwise silent home. In the morning, it was worse. She was singing. He walked into the kitchen and nearly tripped over her barefoot, in his robe, flipping pancakes like she'd lived there her whole life. "Oh, hey," she said brightly. "You didn't have milk, so I used yogurt. Hope that's okay." He blinked. "You're cooking?" "I was hungry. And you look like the kind of guy who survives on espresso and protein bars."
"Ido."
"Exactly." She handed him a plate. He didn't take it. She raised an eyebrow. "You let me stay." Least you can do is eat my pancakes. He finally took the plate, more out of confusion than hunger. And then he ate them. They were good. Too good. By noon, a mechanic came to tow her car. It would take days to fix. I know you don't do guests, Willa said, biting her lip. But would it be completely insane to ask if I could stay just a bit longer? Brayden stared at her. Her hair was damp. She smelled like his shampoo. There was flour on her cheek, and she'd made his kitchen smell like cinnamon and warmth and things he hadn't felt since his parents died. She was chaos, and he couldn't stop letting her in. One more day, he said quietly. But that night, she made grilled cheese and danced barefoot in the living room to music he forgot he owned. And the next morning, he found a note taped to the fridge that said, "You need more butter." And friends. She stayed another day, then another. And suddenly, Brayden Tate, the man who hadn't let a soul into his villa in years, was waking up to the sound of laughter echoing down his marble halls. Willa laughed at everything. At burnt toast. At the way he folded towels. At herself, when she tripped on the polished floors. She filled the quiet with humming, stories, and warmth. He should have hated it, but he didn't. He watched her dance through the villa like she belonged there. He listened when she talked about her childhood in a small town, her dreams of opening a bakery, her dog who'd passed last year. He told her things too. Things he hadn't said aloud in years. Like how he built his tech company from a college dorm room. How he lost his brother to a car accident. How the world felt too loud, too fake, too much until she walked in with daisies and ruined his fence. She didn't ask for money. Or favors. Or attention. She just wanted pancakes. And suddenly, he wanted to give her everything. The storm cut the power that night. Willa was in the middle of rinsing shampoo out of her hair when everything went dark, and the sudden silence was so complete that for a second, she wondered if the world had ended. She emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a thick towel, her hair dripping, her face flushed from the heat. The corridor outside her room was pitch black, save for a faint glow flickering from deeper in the house. She followed it barefoot, cautiously, her fingers brushing the wall for balance. When she reached the grand sitting room, Brayden was standing by the fireplace, coaxing a flame out of a stack of logs. The light danced across his face's sharp jawline, focused expression, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked like he belonged in another century. "You have a fireplace," she said, surprised. He didn't look up. "I had it installed for emergencies. I don't use it. Guess tonight qualifies." He struck the match again. It caught, finally. The fire crackled to life, shadows flickering over the room's stone walls and arched ceiling. He stepped back, watching the flames settle. Willa crossed her arms over her chest. "You know, most people just light a candle and call it a night." Brayden glanced over at her. "We're not most people." She laughed softly, then nodded toward a velvet armchair. "Mind if I sit? Or is that strictly for display?" He didn't answer, but she took the seat anyway, curling her legs beneath her. The heat from the fire reached her skin, warming the chill from her damp hair. Brayden moved to the opposite chair and sat, his gaze unreadable. She tilted her head. "You don't like the dark, do you?" His jaw tensed, but he didn't deny it. "I used to be terrified of it," she admitted. "When I was little, I thought the shadows moved when I blinked. Drove my dad nuts. He had to install a night light shaped like a duck." He didn't reply right away. Then, quietly, "My brother used to hide under the bed and grab my ankles." Willa laughed, startled. "Seriously?" Brayden gave a short nod. He thought it was hilarious. "I didn't sleep without looking under the frame for years." She smiled, watching the firelight shimmer in his eyes. "Sounds like you miss him." "I do." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that didn't feel heavy or awkward, just full of unspoken thoughts. Willa pulled the towel tighter around her. "So, what happens when the storm knocks out the generator?" Do you just brood in the dark until the world rights itself? He looked at her, something flickering behind his eyes. I don't brood. You totally brood. Brayden leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What do you do when the power goes out? Make s'mores. Read ghost stories. Drink wine. I don't have marshmallows. You don't have friends either, but here we are. He looked at her again, this time longer. You're not what I expected. She raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? Someone who would have left the second she got a signal. I almost did, she said honestly. Then I saw how empty this place feels. Brayden said nothing. The fire popped between them. You built all this, she continued. The house, the company, the silence. What did you think it would give you? Control, he said after a moment.
Peace.
Security. Has it? His throat worked, but no sound came. Willa stood, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out into the pitch-black beyond. You ever wonder what it would be like to just start over? Every day. She turned to face him. Then why haven't you? Because I don't know what I'd be without all this. Willa stepped closer. Maybe you'd be better. He stared at her unmoving. She reached out, gently touched his hand resting on the arm of the chair. You don't have to keep holding everything up on your own, you know. Sometimes it's okay to let someone else in. He didn't pull away. The wind howled outside, but inside, the fire glowed steady. The next morning, the power returned with a low hum. But the air between them had shifted. Brayden was already in the kitchen when Willa padded in, wearing one of his old sweatshirts she'd found buried in the guest closet. She looked at him differently now, like she'd seen him beyond the walls and the money and the control. He was pouring water for tea, not coffee. She raised an eyebrow. Tea. He didn't look up. You said I drink too much espresso. She blinked, then smiled. You remembered. I remember everything you say. The kettle whistled. He poured her a cup, slid it across the counter without meeting her eyes. She took it, sipped, and grimaced. Okay, yeah, you definitely need to work on your tea game. Brayden finally looked at her, and for the first time, there was something soft in his expression. Teach me. Deal. The day unfolded gently. He followed her out to the garden behind the villa, where she knelt in the dirt and pointed out herbs growing wild between the cobblestones. He didn't tell her they were weeds. She plucked them anyway, claiming they made great garnishes. Later, they sat on the terrace, a blanket draped across their legs, watching clouds drift over the lake. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore, it was comfortable. It was full. She turned to him suddenly. What's the most spontaneous thing you've ever done? Brayden thought. Bought a building in Tokyo because someone told me I couldn't. That's not spontaneous. That's petty. He glanced at her. I don't do spontaneous. You do now. She stood up, grabbed his hand, and pulled him toward the edge of the dock. The lake shimmered below, dark and glassy. No, he said immediately. Absolutely not. You're wearing clothes, she said. You'll dry. I don't swim. You don't dance. You don't host guests. You don't drink tea. And yet. He hesitated. Then, without warning, she jumped. The splash echoed across the lake. Brayden stood frozen, staring into the water as her head broke the surface and she called, Come on, millionaire man. What's the worst that could happen? He swore under his breath. Then he jumped in after her. When they surfaced, laughing and breathless, the world felt different. Warmer. Closer. Less alone. Brayden stood motionless in the center of the kitchen, holding 2 mugs of cocoa, unable to remember the last time he'd made something for someone else. Willa was on the floor in the sunroom, surrounded by a mess of yarn and a half-assembled puzzle she'd pulled from a storage cabinet he hadn't touched in years. He crossed the room and held out a mug. She glanced up, strands of hair falling across her cheek, and took it with a pleased hum. "Thank you," she said, blowing over the surface. "You ever realize how loud a house can be when it's too quiet?" "Yes," Brayden replied, lowering himself into the armchair across from her. "That's the point." Willa tilted her head. "You built this place to be loud in its silence. Every polished surface, every echo, it's all designed to remind people they don't belong here, unless they're invited." Her eyes flicked up. "So why me?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. She studied him for a moment, then went back to sorting puzzle pieces. He watched her work for a while, the way her fingers danced lightly over the cardboard edges, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You're not afraid of being alone," he said suddenly. "But you hate being forgotten." Willa froze, a corner piece in her hand. "I'm not wrong." She set the piece down and leaned back. "My mom left when I was 13. No note, no warning.
Just gone.
She didn't even take her favorite earrings. My dad said she always needed more than what we could give her." Her voice didn't waver. "I guess I promised myself I wouldn't disappear like that. Not without leaving something behind." "You think laughter's enough?" "I think it's better than silence." Brayden nodded once, then stood. "Come with me." She followed him down a hallway she hadn't noticed before, past a locked door he opened with a touchpad. Inside, the air was cool and dry. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound books, antique cameras, and rare instruments. "It's my private collection," he said. "No one's seen this room in over a year." Willa stepped inside slowly, her fingers trailing the edge of a shelf. "These cameras. They look like they haven't been used." "They haven't." She turned to him.
Why?
"They belong to my brother. He was the artist. I kept them, but I never picked them up." Willa walked to a wooden box on the far shelf and opened it. Inside sat a vintage Rolleiflex, the lens still clean, the leather still intact. "May I?" she asked. He nodded. She lifted the camera, adjusted the viewfinder, and pointed it toward him. "You never smile," she murmured. Brayden frowned slightly. "I'm serious," she said. "Even when you laugh, your eyes don't soften. It's like you're waiting for something to go wrong." "Everything does," he said quietly. She lowered the camera. "Not everything." He stepped closer. "Tell me something real." Willa didn't hesitate. "I used to steal sugar packets from diners as a kid and hide them under my pillow, just in case we ran out at home." Brayden blinked. "Your turn," she said. He set his jaw. "I once bought my father a yacht for his birthday. He told me it was too small." She tilted her head. "Did you try to buy his approval?" "I thought I already had it." Silence filled the space between them, heavy but not sharp. "You know," she said, turning the camera over in her hands, "you live like a man who's already lost everything and is just waiting for the rest to be taken." "Maybe I am." She looked up at him. "But what if nothing's coming to take it this time?" Brayden didn't answer. That night, she didn't go back to the guest wing. Instead, they sat in the observatory on the third floor, the ceiling of glass revealing a sky full of stars. She curled up on the velvet chaise, and he sat beside her, their shoulders just barely touching. "You ever think about what it would be like if you weren't you?" she asked. "All the time. If you weren't a millionaire, if you didn't build empires, if you just worked at a bookstore or ran a cafe. I'd probably still be lonely." Willa turned to face him. "But you wouldn't be unreachable." He inhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the stars. "That's the problem. I don't know how to be reachable anymore." She rested her head against the back of the chair. "You do. You just forgot." They didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched out, not empty, but full of things they didn't yet know how to say. The next morning, Brayden was gone. Willa wandered the villa, calling his name, her voice echoing off the polished walls. His car was missing from the garage. For the first time in days, the house felt like it had before hollow. She found a note on the kitchen counter, scrawled in bold, impatient handwriting. Need to handle something.
Stay.
Don't burn the place down. It wasn't a goodbye. She paced the hallways for an hour, then wandered into the music room. It had been locked before. Now it was open. Inside, a baby grand piano sat under a dust-covered sheet. Willa pulled the cover off and pressed one key. The sound rang out, clear and haunting. She sat down and began to play a simple melody, one she remembered from childhood. Her fingers stumbled through the notes, but she kept going, the music filling the space he'd left behind. Brayden returned that night just before sunset. She heard the engine, the crunch of gravel, the door opening. He walked into the music room, paused in the doorway, and watched her play. "You left," she said without looking up. "I went to see someone." She turned.
Who?
"My father." He stepped closer. "I told him I sold the yacht." Willa blinked. "Did you?"
No.
"But I told him I did, just to see if he noticed. And
He didn't.
Willa stood, walking toward him slowly. "So why go?" "Because I needed to know if I still wanted anything from him." He looked at her. "I don't." She studied his face. There was something different in it. Something unguarded. "Then what do you want now?" He reached up, brushing her hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering just a moment too long. "You." The silence that followed was deafening. Willa's voice was barely above a whisper. "You're not very good at this." "I know. But you're trying." "I am." She took his hand. "Then let's see what happens when you stop pushing people away." He pulled her in slowly, deliberately, like he wasn't just touching her, but memorizing what it felt like to be held without armor. And for the first time in years, the villa didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like home. Willa stood barefoot on the stone path behind the villa, watching the final traces of morning mist lift from the lake. Her hands were dusted with flour, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the oven, and yet her eyes were distant. She'd woken before sunrise, unable to sleep, and wandered into the kitchen. Brayden hadn't joined her. He hadn't said much since the night he returned since he'd told her he wanted her. He hadn't backed away from her touch, hadn't built new walls around himself, but there was a tension in him now, like he was holding his breath. She heard the crunch of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. "I thought I'd find you here," Brayden said, his voice low with sleep. "I've been thinking," Willa replied without turning. "Maybe I should head back soon." He didn't respond right away. "You could stay," he said. "Longer." She turned to face him. "That's not an answer." Brayden stepped closer. "Then let me give you one." Before she could reply, he reached for her hand and pressed something into her palm. She opened her fingers and stared down at the key resting there, small, plain silver one, worn at the edges. "It's for the gallery room," he said. "You haven't seen it yet." She frowned. "There's another room?" "There's one I never opened. Not since the accident." Willa's expression softened as she closed her fingers around the key. "Are you sure?" "I wouldn't have given it to you if I wasn't." She studied him for a moment. "Then let's go." They walked in silence through the west corridor, where the walls were lined with paintings she had noticed before, abstract, bold, chaotic pieces that looked nothing like the rest of the villa's cautious perfection. He gestured to a narrow door at the end. She unlocked it. The room beyond was flooded with light from skylights above. The walls were covered in photographs unframed, taped edge-to-edge candid shots of people laughing, dancing, embracing. Life, in all its wild imperfection. Willa stepped inside slowly, her gaze moving from image to image. "These are beautiful." "They're his," Brayden said. "Every one." She turned. "Your brother?" He used to say the world was too fast for memories, so he captured them before they slipped away. She walked along the wall, touching the edge of a photo showing two boys covered in mud, grinning like maniacs. "He was reckless," Brayden continued. But he was fearless. He made people feel like they mattered. I didn't realize how rare that was until he was gone. Willa looked over her shoulder. You've been trying to protect him by preserving this. But maybe it was never meant to be hidden. Brayden nodded slowly. I thought if I locked it away, I wouldn't risk forgetting. But instead, I forgot how it felt to live. Willa walked back to him and placed the key on a nearby shelf. Then let's bring it back. Later that afternoon, she found herself standing in the garden, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in soil as she helped Brayden replant the neglected beds lining the stone patio. He worked beside her, silent but present, sweat beading at his temples as he dug without hesitation. You know, she said as she tucked a lavender plant into place, I never expected I'd be giving gardening tips to a man who probably owns half of Silicon Valley. Brayden glanced at her. I don't own half, maybe a third. She laughed. Modest. He looked at the row of new plants. I wanted to change the world. I just didn't know that meant starting with a shovel. You changed mine, she said quietly. He met her eyes. You changed mine first. That evening, the villa was lit by candles and the scent of rosemary bread she'd pulled from the oven. They sat across from each other at the long dining table that had always been set but never used, a place that once echoed with emptiness, now filled with warmth. Willa picked at her salad. So, what happens next? I have an idea, Brayden said, setting down his fork. But it might sound crazy. I like crazy. He stood, walked to the sideboard, and returned with a small envelope. He handed it to her. Willa opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper, an official proposal for a property transfer. Her name was listed as co-owner of a lakeside inn. She looked up, stunned. I bought it this morning, Brayden said. It's an old place, about 20 minutes from here. Needs work. But it has a kitchen large enough for a bakery and a garden that could use your hands. Her voice was barely audible. Why would you do this? Because you brought life back into a house that was only ever built to keep it out. And because every time you laugh, I remember what it feels like to belong. Willa shook her head slowly. This is insane. Probably. I still don't know if I can make scones without burning them. You'll figure it out. She looked down at the paper again. You're not asking me to stay as a guest, are you? Not this time. He stepped around the table and dropped to one knee beside her chair. Willa froze. I don't have a ring, Brayden said. Not yet. But I do have a key to a life I didn't know I wanted until you walked through my door. So, if you'll stay, if you'll build it with me, I promise I'll never lock another door again. Tears welled in her eyes, unguarded and real. You can't just say things like that, Brayden. I mean every word. She reached for him, pulling him up, and kissed him with all the fire and tenderness of someone who'd spent her whole life searching for home and finally found it. The next morning, the villa was alive. The scent of fresh bread and orange zest drifted through the halls. Laughter echoed from the kitchen, where Willa stood barefoot on a chair, instructing Brayden on how to whisk egg whites without ruining them. The windows were thrown open, the breeze carrying music into rooms that had known only silence. Later that week, the inn's restoration began. Willa painted walls, Brayden installed shelves, and together they built something that didn't just reflect them, it welcomed others in. The once reclusive millionaire, whose name had filled headlines for years now, spent his days covered in dust, carrying lumber and learning how to bake croissants. He hosted dinners. He danced in the kitchen. He smiled not just with his mouth, but with his entire soul. And every evening, they returned to the villa, now full of color and sound, and sat by the fire not to escape the world, but to remember the day they chose to build one together. The man who invited no guests into his home had finally opened every door, and Willa had filled it with a love he never thought he'd deserve. Brayden adjusted the final hinge on the pastry case, while Willa stood behind the counter of the newly restored inn, tying her apron with fingers that trembled only slightly. Outside, the golden afternoon light spilled through the wide windows, casting a soft glow over the polished wood floors and fresh white walls. The place no longer smelled of dust and mildew. It smelled like cinnamon, lemon zest, and new beginnings. "You're nervous," Brayden said, straightening to his full height. "I'm not," Willa replied, though her voice betrayed her. Okay, yes. Maybe a little." He walked around the counter, took her flour-dusted hands, and pressed a kiss to her temple. "It's just a soft opening. A few neighbors. Some curious hikers. You've got this." "I'm not worried about the food," she said. "I'm worried about people liking it enough to come back. They'll come back because of you." "I'm serious." "So am I." She exhaled and leaned her forehead against his chest. "What if I fail? Then we'll fail together." He tipped her chin up until she met his eyes. "But I don't think you will." The doorbell chimed as the first guests stepped inside, bringing with them the scent of pine and mountain air. Willa pulled herself upright, rolled her shoulders back, and smiled as she welcomed them in. The inn's dining space filled slowly over the next hour. Locals who had heard rumors of the reclusive tech mogul's sudden reappearance, travelers who'd spotted the hand-painted sign at the edge of the road, and a few familiar faces from the nearby town who remembered Willa from her high school days. Brayden moved quietly between tables, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, and watching her work. He didn't hover.
He didn't direct.
He simply supported. Later, when the last guest had gone and the sun had dipped behind the hills, Willa stood at the window, her apron wrinkled and her cheeks flushed. "Did you see that woman with the red scarf?" she asked. "She said my rosemary scones reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen." "I did." She cried a little. "I notice." Willa turned to him. "This feels real. It feels like mine." Brayden nodded. "Because it is." They closed up together, moving through the space with the unspoken rhythm of people who had learned each other's ways. He wiped down the counter as she stacked clean plates, and when the last dish had been put away, he reached into the drawer beneath the register and pulled out a small, velvet box. She froze. "Don't panic," he said, opening it. Inside was a simple ring rose gold, with a single oval diamond flanked by 2 tiny sapphires. Willa stared at it, mouth parted. "I didn't give you this the night I should have," he said. "I didn't want to offer something just for the sake of timing. But now, I'm not asking you to stay because you've made my house feel like home. I'm asking because you're my home." She blinked, and a tear slipped down her cheek. "I want to build mornings with you. I want to argue about how salty the soup is and fall asleep with you beside me in a bed that doesn't feel cold anymore. I want to wake up knowing that loving you isn't a choice, it's my default setting." Willa let out a choked laugh. "That was almost romantic until you made it sound like software." Brayden stepped closer. "Then let me say it better." He took her hand, pressed the ring into her palm, and whispered, "Will you marry me?" She nodded, tears falling freely now.
Yes.
Yes, 100 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and she threw her arms around his neck. When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed or urgent. It was full, steady, and certain. The kind of kiss that made promises without needing words. They were married that spring on the edge of the lake, beneath a canopy of wildflowers. The ceremony was small, just a handful of guests seated on wooden benches, the scent of honeysuckle drifting through the air. Willa wore a dress she'd sewn herself from antique lace she found in a forgotten trunk at the inn, and Brayden wore no tie, just an open-collar shirt and a look of quiet awe every time he glanced at her. Mira, the elderly woman who lived down the road, made pies for the reception. Brayden's assistant, who had once only known him through curt emails, gave a toast that left everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. There were no press releases. No headlines. Just joy. They spent their honeymoon not on a private island, but upstairs in the inn, sleeping late, dancing in the kitchen, and writing love notes on flour-dusted scraps of paper. As the months passed, the inn became more than a business. It became a refuge. Artists stayed in the upstairs rooms to finish novels or paint new collections. Retired couples came to celebrate anniversaries. Local teenagers stopped by after school for Willa's lemon bars and advice on love. Brayden, once known for his silence and solitude, became the man who fixed leaky faucets and read bedtime stories to guests' children when they forgot to bring books. He still owned his company, but now he worked remotely, trading boardrooms for a view of the lake and quarterly reports for dinner menus. On their first anniversary, Willa surprised him with a garden bench engraved with the words, "You let me in, and I never left." He added a second line beneath it, "You made me better, and I never looked back." They sat on that bench every evening, watching the sun slip behind the mountains, fingers intertwined. There were no more locked doors, no more silence. Just a life they'd built together, messy, beautiful, and entirely their own.